Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a game designer and lifelong Age of Empires enthusiast, and today I'd like to share with you another theory-crafted civilization idea, something that, if I had my way, I would love to see implemented into this game that I have known and loved for so much of my life. Today we'll be tackling the Lombards. Don't know who they are? Well, hopefully that will be explained in due course. Even if you don't know the game particularly well, please do stick around because I'll be focusing my presentation here on the historical elements of the Lombards and how I've integrated their history into my design choices. If you'd like more of the nitty-gritty details, I have linked a comprehensive civilization document down below, as well as links to my sources. As of now, the Lombards can be interacted with within Age of Empires, specifically in campaigns as represented by some combination of the Italians and the Goths. I'll be drawing elements from both of those civilizations in my design here, but the goal is to make the Lombards feel very much like their own beast, something that can be played and enjoyed in multiplayer, as well as being met in single player as a unique and discrete civilization unto itself. A couple of disclaimers as per usual. I am 100% not a historian and often encounter bad or false history in my studies. Please do not hold it against me and do not see me as any sort of authoritative source. Additionally, obviously I haven't tested any of this. There may be egregious mistakes made that I just would never be able to catch unless I were able to see it actually played live. And something I forgot to mention last time, I consume a decent amount of content in the Age of Empires sphere, and I personally love looking up other people's theory-crafted civilization builds. That being said, I have not taken ideas from any of the other builds for the Lombards that may exist out on the internet right now. This is all my own work that I am drawing directly from the original historical sources. Definitely go and look up what other people have done with the Lombards. There's some great stuff out there, I have no doubt. As mentioned, I myself am a game designer, and whenever I put my mind to a build, I tend to focus on pushing boundaries and adding complexity. I am a big lover of complexity, and so if you're not, you will definitely have aspects of my build that you substantially disagree with. Additionally, I find there to be a lot of value in increasing rather than decreasing variety and making every civilization feel more unique and different. Once again, if you are more of a fan of streamlined and simplified builds, this one might not be for you. All the same, I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments section below, regardless of whether you agree with elements of my design or substantially disagree with them. So, who were the Lombards? Well, originally they were actually a Scandinavian tribe originating on the island of Scania. This is in the Baltic Sea. Pretty small place. But when they migrated south as part of the great barbarian rovings that happened around 400 AD that eventually led to the fall of Rome, they encountered resistance among many of the other Germanic tribes of the areas. They established themselves as being fairly dominant, leading to a couple of major victories over some other prominent tribes, such as the Gepids. Here I've represented them as Magyars, but they were probably closer to German Goths. In their campaign versus the Gepids, the Lombards demonstrated remarkable leadership and ability to rally the disparate barbarian tribes. In this particular case, they allied with the nomadic Avars, represented here by the Huns, in order to defeat the Gepids at a couple of major battles. I think one of them was right over the Danube River. This prominence among the many northern pagan tribes led to them actually mustering a large barbarian force for a mass invasion of Italy. They aligned with themselves with the Goths and Bulgars and all sorts of other tribesfolk and smashed their way in through northern Italy, defeating the many settled Gothic tribes of the region, as well as the more established Italian or Proto-Italian city-states, and even the mighty Byzantine Empire. Eventually, there formed kind of a demilitarized zone right along the top of Italy's boot. On one side, the northern side, were the Lombards and their allies, and on the southern side were the Byzantines, holding the fort against what seemed like an endless tide of barbarian forces. The Lombards, whose name translates roughly to long beard, like think about it, long Bard, right? Langobard is how they were often called in old texts, were known for their unbelievable military power during this era. They had the greatest generals, they had a wholly militarized civilian ship. It was very hard to defeat a Lombard army, especially when supplemented by hundreds upon thousands of their associated allies. So much so that it wasn't long before the Lombards ruled most of Italy. They kicked out the Byzantines and their associated allies in the region, they took over Rome, and they extended as far south as Sicily. That is, until Charlemagne decided he didn't like a bunch of pagans ruling the seat of Christendom. And so he came charging in and managed to, with, again, a couple of his own allies, including the papacy itself, kick the Lombards into the south. This allowed a lot of the previous occupants of Italy to comfortably reestablish themselves, and over time, the Lombard city-states of southern Italy became Christianized themselves. In fact, they remained a pretty substantial presence in Italy right up until the turn of the first millennia AD. They did have to contend with the papacy trying to get allies to move in and conquer new territory. They had to deal with the Holy Roman Empire. They had to deal with Moorish pirates raiding from the south. But most importantly, they had to deal with the Haute-Vie family, the Normans who eventually would go on to conquer and rule Sicily. It was because of the Haute-Vies that the Lombards were eventually brought down, and the pages of history were well and truly closed on their once mighty empire. That being said, presence of the Lombards can be seen all through Italy. Their architecture remains in a great many locations, especially in the south. Lombardic phrases kind of wormed their way into the Italian language. Of course, an entire part of northern Italy is called Lombardy. And so even though these mighty half-pagan, half-Christian warlords were kicked off the throne, they left a long-standing mark on the history of the region and interacted with just about every other major power in Europe that had even the slightest amount of presence between 500 and 1000 AD. So as I was studying Lombard history, I came across a couple of very unmistakable themes that I'm sure you have picked out yourself. The first one being warfare, specifically a kind of migratory warfare, as they came from Scania all the way through Germany, in through northern Italy, and all the way to South Italy. And no matter where they went, they brought battle with them. These guys had a major militarized culture, and more importantly, whenever the Lombards would move into an area, they would very happily park their new homes atop the ruins of their defeated enemies. They had no issue with using pre-existing architecture and similar, and just kind of, moving in, setting up shop, and being perfectly happy until they find a greener pasture to conquer once again. I even found a source relating that they would even settle these ancient Italian cities that were previously Roman. They would burn down a whole swath of unnecessary civilian housing, and they would let that area become pastureland for their animals while they lived in the cool, ritzy, luxurious areas that had previously been reserved for nobility. The Lombards definitely had a smaller population, and there were less distinctions between their nobility and their commoners than there were in other European societies. Still distinctions, but less so. And so there was definitely room for even their more rank-and-file individuals to live in relative luxury once they conquered some fertile new region. Similarly, the Lombards, while they did remain pretty staunchly pagan for a couple hundred years, they were very happy to take on new customs based on what they found beneficial out of an area. They took on new languages, they took on new religions, of course Christianity, though they retained a lot of pagan elements even as Christianization entered into their culture. I found this entertaining source talking about how the papacy was so frustrated by the Lombards because even when they would say they would be Christian, they would still have pagan things like sacred groves and shrines to Wotan, their version of Odin, and a couple of other things, and as well as their old pagan holidays, and they would just kind of put a big coat of Christian paint over the top of it and say, there, we're Christian now, stop bothering us. It was brilliant. They're a very pragmatic people, and they were very happy appropriating the technologies of areas they settled in order to improve their own day-to-day lives. So with these themes in mind, I went into this build having a pretty good idea of what I wanted out of a Lombard civilization in Age of Empires. The first of it being, Hyperaggression. These guys need to move into the opponent's territory, park themselves on top of critical resources, and dominate them as much as they can to ensure the opponent can't gain a technological advantage over them. In history, that was a big part of what led to the Lombards' downfall. So, I decided to focus my build in large part on their early game. My first civilization bonus allows them to train all military units much faster when their population is low. This will allow you to get an early rush out much quicker, not to mention allowing you to stay on one town center longer in Castle Age rather than booming, so that you can be sending out raids and pushing hard against your opponent's front line and preventing them from building up a comfortable foothold. Additionally, I don't know how feasible this mechanic would be, but I have an idea for a bonus where whenever an enemy building is destroyed and leaves that ruin pile, you know what I mean? If a Lombard building is constructed on such ruins, it is cheaper and faster to create. Once again, not sure how feasible it is to implement a mechanic like that, but it is unbelievably fitting for their history, and I thought it would allow for their really fun kind of forward-moving park your base on top of your opponent's sort of strategy that could lead to some really cool, messy maps. And on top of that, whenever a Lombard player destroys an enemy drop-off building, mill, town center, lumber camp, mining camp, they would gain a small purse of resources as an immediate one-time reward, probably somewhere in the 50 to 100 of the relevant resource range, with town centers, of course, giving you a lot more. And lastly, in the hyper-aggression vein, the Lombards' team bonus allows them and all of their allies to research feudal blacksmith technologies instantly. Still have to pay the resource, but it allows you to be very flexible when you are rushing and wait until the very last moment to pick up a critical blacksmith technology to win an engagement. When you put all of these different bonuses together, it gives the Lombards an amazing set of standard rushes. They can do anything. They can do man-at-arms, they can do archers, they can do scout cavalry, they have full tech trees for all of them, and all of these bonuses in some way assist them in doing a rush. The one thing they can't do is towers, and I'll get to that in a moment, but the other downside this has is that your opponent will know almost for certain that a rush is coming their way. Now, in addition to the 3 standard unit rushes, the Lombards have a 4th up their sleeve, and that comes from their unique unit, the Arimanus. The Arimanus is available in the feudal age from the barracks, also trainable from a castle once you create one. The Arimanus is in many ways comparable to a man-at-arms, similarly to how a Sicilian sergeant is comparable to men-at-arms. Whereas the sergeant is more survivable and slow, however, the Arimanus is a bit faster and squishier than a man-at-arms would normally be, allowing them to be a little bit better for raiding, but not have quite as much of an impact overall. That being said, Arimanus are able to build buildings. In the feudal age, they're limited to houses, but as soon as you hit castle, they can start to create barracks. And in imperial age, once you get the elite upgrade, they can construct fortifications as well. This allows you to capitalize effectively on the cheaper building on ruins bonus if you're doing a bunch of forward aggression, and also allows you to cover barracks all over the map once you have the resources and the Arimani available to you later in the game. This gets into the second of the Lombards' major strengths, that being their infantry. As mentioned, their feudal age rushes are all excellent, but as soon as they hit the castle age and onwards, they have a lot more trouble diversifying their army. But even in the late game, their infantry will dominate many other civilizations. Besides having a complete tech tree, their castle age unique technology, Gaerethinx, is completely geared around boosting your infantry units. This is a weird technology that plays into the sub-theme I put into the Lombards of tempo. Once you research Gaerethinx, every time you research a technology, all infantry of yours anywhere on the map will gain a substantial but temporary armor bonus, somewhere in the range of +2/+2. However, this bonus would wear off after about 30 seconds, meaning you'd really effectively need to time when a technology finished to when you start with a big infantry push. Additionally, Gaerethinx effects would not stack, so if you researched multiple technologies, you wouldn't get multiple bonuses, it would simply refresh the timer. Additionally, their Imperial Age unique technology, Pharai, would also benefit their infantry substantially. Whenever one of your barracks are destroyed, once you have researched the Farai technology, they would spawn a bunch of infantry units right on top of your opponent. Probably 2 of each of their sword line, their spear line, and their arimani. This would mean that once you use your arimanes to, like I said, carpet the map in barracks, it will make it very hard for your opponent to chip through them, which will allow you to spam infantry to your heart's content and fire on all cylinders until they find a way to put a better stop to the problem. Now, beyond infantry and feudal aggression, it's not as though the Lombards are useless. In Castle Age, their knights and crossbows are fully upgraded, including thumb ring. They also do, of course, benefit from the tempo bonuses gained from their feudal rushes, because if you already have map control going into the Castle Age, you can capitalize on that even further with a more powerful unit. Once they hit Imperial Age, though, those units really do start to fall off, and you'll need to rely more substantially on your infantry. But that's not the only thing the Lombards can do acceptably. They're also very good at countering enemy rushes. Not only do they have all of their early game benefits, which are just as good when you are being rushed as when you are doing the rushing, but they have another civilization bonus wherein their villagers have bonus attack and armor specifically versus enemy soldiers. Versus enemy buildings, tower rushes, animals, doesn't do you any good. But against soldiers specifically, their villagers are remarkably tanky and dangerous, making it so that enemy early aggression is going to have a lot more of a tough time putting a dent in your eco. As mentioned, the Lombards do also have a sub-theme of tempo, wherein you are incentivized to effectively time your attacks and defenses based on other in-game factors. This will mostly come into play in the form of Gairothinks. If you can make a push with your Arimani and leave a bunch of barracks for your opponents to clean up on the way out, it will make it much harder for them to retaliate against you as you are rebuilding a new army. It's little tricks like this that will allow the Lombards to survive their incredibly weak mid-game and get to a point where they can infantry spam like a Goth player later on. This segues well into the Lombards' weaknesses, and they have many of them. Most of these weaknesses are most notable in Imperial Age, as their tech tree is atrocious. They are missing out on tons of useful late-game options, as well as a number of very important blacksmith upgrades. If you know the game, then seeing that red X through Bracer hurts you as much as it hurts me. That being said, the Lombards are not completely lost once they hit the late game. If they can hold on and research enough technologies, their last civilization bonus will kick in. This bonus will unlock some of these critical missing unit upgrades once the Lombard player has researched a certain threshold of total technological research. This means that once you start hitting late game, a Lombard player is very heavily incentivized to diversify and research stuff even if they're not entirely sure they'll need it, such that they can reach those critical unit upgrades that might open up the unit they need to win a late game stalemate. The other of the Lombards' major weaknesses, of course, are their defenses. Specifically, their early game defenses. They are missing both stone wall and watchtowers. Really crippling for their early game defenses, as well as completely scuppering any attempt at a tower rush. However, they can construct fortified walls and guard towers once you research those respective technologies in the Castle Age. Once again, encouraging the Lombard player to diversify and branch out once they reach a later stage of the game and their early game aggression bonuses are starting to fade into the past. Lastly, the Lombards have an underwhelming economy. Not only are they missing plenty of technologies, but they don't have any direct economy bonus, unless you want to count the bonus villager defenses versus raids, or the free resources from destroying drop-off buildings, both of which are situational at best. So how do I think the Lombards would play? I think you know as well as I. Aggro! Aggro, aggro everywhere. They're going to be rushing up a storm. In the early game, you have access to your militia, into man-at-arms, and Arimani. You can smash your way through the enemy base, build buildings on top of everything, get resources from their drop-off sites. It'll be a bloodbath, especially since they have a lot less ability to hurt you until they get some real power units like knights. You also, as mentioned, have access to every rush in the game besides tower rushes, and can do them remarkably well. The Lombards are going to be incredibly effective as an early game civilization, and I wouldn't be surprised if many games are won or lost before Castle Age even rolls around. That being said, their mid-game is also somewhat respectable. They have Gairothinks if they can shift their military towards being infantry-focused and capitalize on the bonuses it brings. They also can make for a good fast Imperial. If you've stomped your opponents so effectively in early game they can't really spread out and colonize the map once you're weak, then you are safe to get up to Imperial Age and begin to construct a more prominent fighting force of your own. They also have a very good castle drop, both because their Arimani are good at walling in their villagers to protect them, and because the ground they gained in the early game can later be capitalized upon in the mid-game for strong tempo pushes. Also, the villager anti-soldier bonus really helps out when you're trying to plop down a castle. Once you hit Imperial Age, however, as the Lombards, you're really going to have to rely on your infantry. You have barracks everywhere, you have some strong soldiers coming out of them, and with your Arimani you can do these effective creeping advances, spreading barracks all over the map. You do also have the ability to tech towards power units. It's just much harder to do with the Lombards than it is with other civilizations. If you tend to be more of a casual player, you're not going to feel this quite as much as if you are more competitive, but as a competitive player, it's not uncommon to only research 10 or 15 technologies in the entire game, and having most of your late game power units locked behind 18, 24, in some cases up to 42 technologies can really sting. If someone told you that most of Italy was ruled by a pagan power during a big chunk of the early and high Middle Ages, I don't think you would necessarily believe them. And that's part of the thing that I find so compelling and interesting about Lombard culture and history. They came from the north, and as such, their architecture will be Central European, similar to civilizations like the Goths or Vikings. They would also have unique skins for their castle, barracks, and university. The castle, because it seems to be the status quo these days, the barracks because it's their most important building, and their university to represent their colonization of Italian city-states and appropriation of the knowledge stored within. Unsurprisingly, they would speak Lombardic. Ben riet, ladies and gentlemen. This is a somewhat archaic language, and I wasn't able to find fantastic translations for it online, but the Age of Empires guys seem to have done harder languages in the past, so I think it's abundantly doable to have this one in there as well. Their wonder would be the Santa Sofia Church. It's currently located in Benevento and is an excellent example of what medieval Lombard architecture looked like when they actually built it themselves and didn't just steal it from the Italians. Quite a beautiful building. I could see it maybe even being expanded a little bit to make it look a little bit more grand. On to campaigns. In my eyes, the obvious first choice is that of Alboin. He was the king of the Lombards that led them into Italy, uniting the disparate pagan tribes and smashing the Byzantines, the Italians, the Goths, and everyone else who stood in his path. If I recall correctly, it was an assassination plot led by his wife that eventually brought him down. This is a recurring theme in Lombard history. They had a lot of assassinations. But either way, Alboin was one hell of a warlord. He led many famous battles and sieges, fought against at least half a dozen unique opponents, and a campaign with him as the protagonist would likely feature upwards of 10 or 11 existing civilizations. Just an excellent melting pot of warfare with him at the helm. Another excellent choice, and someone who is actually slightly featured in the game right now, is Liutprand. He ruled during the 700s-ish and was one of the first Lombard leaders to realize the value of Christianizing his people. He brought about a bunch of legal reforms, helped Charlemagne fight off the Moors, and is generally remembered very favorably as a ruler. He wasn't quite as warlike as many other Lombards were before him, but he did lead a number of campaigns to expand the dominion, especially in the face of pressure from the Christian states. But these two were both Dark Age leaders. What about later on in the Lombard legacy? Well, that would bring me to around the turn of the millennia with one of the last great Lombard leaders, that being Gaiamar IV. He ruled a South Italian city-state of Salerno and was one of the Lombard lineage to face off against the Norman Hauteville family. But that was far from the only thing that Gaiamar did. He also fought against Moorish pirates coming up from the south across the Mediterranean. He fought against the Papal States while also pitting them against some of his own rivals. He dealt with a resurgence of the Byzantine Empire and, of course, consolidated power among many of his nearby Lombard rivals. Just a fascinating guy overall, a real political mastermind from everything that I can see. And again, he was assassinated, I think by his wife, again. Now, beyond their own campaigns, I could see them appearing in tons of existing campaigns that are already in the game right now. The Barbarossa campaign has an entire chapter called the Lombard League. Attila the Hun would definitely feature the Lombards, especially in the last scenario when you're fighting all across Italy. The Alaric campaigns, I believe, also explicitly mention the Lombards already. The Bari campaigns are exactly in Lombard country during part of the height of their reign. Sforza would have some Lombard appearances, just because there's so much Italian in there already, may as well mix it up. And lastly, the good old Haute-Vies would have the Lombards as one of their primary rivals in their own campaign appearances to boot. Do you see what I mean about this civilization being like made for this game? They feature in so many campaigns already, I just think it would be an absolute shoo-in. And of course, I would be remiss to not mention a couple of the other cool Lombard leaders who would make a great campaign protagonists themselves. Some of them would include Audwin. He was Alwyn's father, and he was the one who led the war against the Gepid tribes alongside the Avars. So this is pre-Italy Lombard wars. Cool idea. Theodolinda is another fascinating character. She was like a Lombard femme fatale. She was married to like 2 or 3 of their kings and was a major force in trying to Christianize the Lombard peoples. She was around during some of the earliest Lombard conquests and really didn't like how pagan everyone was around her. And so by allying herself with the Merovingians in France and some papal powers, she was able to slowly push the Lombard peoples towards Christianization through, again, several different kings, all of whom to which she was the queen. Pretty impressive. There's another character called Sicard of Benevento. He's another of these southern Lombard princes who came along towards the end of their lineage. He fought against the Moors, he fought against Byzantines, he fought against Rome. He did a lot of the same things that Guyamar did, but he was just maybe 50 or so years beforehand. And lastly, there's another prince called Pandulf Ironhead. If that's not a dwarf, I don't know what is. I mean, come on, his name is Pandulf Ironhead. He deserves a frickin' campaign, people. Who are we kidding? Now, within my design, there were plenty of elements that I wasn't quite sure about that I'd like to share with you here. First of all, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Lombards would be a very swingy civilization. They have most of their bonuses around the early game. They deliberately suck ass in the late game. It just might be a risky way to design a civilization to have them this focused on early feudal and castle warfare. There are also clear parallels between them and the gods. They both have the same architecture, they both are coming from the same overall area of the world, they both have a big focus on infantry and crappy defenses. I would like to think that my design leaves the Lombards as feeling very distinct from the gods, but I could see people saying they're a little too similar in their current state. Lastly, I have a number of technology-related bonuses, specifically the one where you can unlock upgrades, as well as Garethynks getting bonuses based on when a technology is researched. I think they're very fun, and I think it's very thematic to have the Lombards be so focused on late-game technology, to represent them trying to catch up to their neighbors once they were well entrenched in Italy. But I could also see it being very hard to track, and no one likes tracking things. So there is a chance that it just isn't really that viable of a mechanic to have in the game. I also had quite a few other ideas that didn't quite make it into the build, many of which I'm still very fond of. For a while, I had this idea where your villagers could commandeer enemy buildings in a similar way to how villagers in the game right now can commandeer a farm. I thought it could be cool if Lombards could do the same thing with walls or houses or drop-off points, but I wasn't really sure how to implement it without it being super cheesy and annoying. I did, however, iterate this to a similar idea called Città ad Isole. This would be a unique technology wherein whenever you place a town center and finish building it, it will immediately convert all nearby buildings that aren't, castles or towers or similar. This could represent the Lombards settling in an enemy city and taking it over, but it could also be incredibly cheesy and annoying to deal with. I'll let you be the judge of that. Similarly, I had a unique unit called the Gastald. This was the Lombard equivalent of a reeve, or like a regional administrator for Lombard principalities. And what they would be is a very heavy infantry unit that could convert buildings like a monk. once again getting back to this theme of taking over the enemy base. I did also at one point have that technology unlocking unit upgrades thing be entirely relegated to university technologies, but the Lombards have a pretty weak university in my build, so it felt like a bit of an awkward non-bow as far as design is concerned. The Lombards were, of course, known to unite disparate tribes, so I thought researching conscription in the castle age from the barracks could be a cool way of representing that. In terms of their military social structure, I had a unique technology called Viri Devoti, which would allow garrisoned infantry to heal much faster. So you could pop some injured soldiers into a castle, heal them up in seconds, and send them back into the field. I thought this was a little too similar to my Georgian unique technology on balance. Plus, I felt like they're good enough at infantry. I didn't need to give them still more things to do with their infantrymen. Along similar lines, there is this famous piece of Lombard legislation by King Rothar called the Edictum Rothari. This would allow villagers to have an aggressive stance. If you've ever played the Spanish once you've researched supremacy, you know how annoying it is that your villagers keep running away from things like skirmishers, even when they're as strong as a longsword or better. So this technology would allow your villagers to be able to fight back more effectively, as well as multiplying their civilization bonus versus enemy soldiers by several orders of magnitude. This one I was really tempted to include, but it is a little too similar to Supremacy, so I thought I'd leave it alone just for now. Last of the ideas that didn't quite make it in, I had another potential unique unit called the Gazindio, which would roughly translate to Retainer. This would also be a heavy infantryman, and it could enter enemy buildings. So the idea here would be you could garrison them inside an enemy castle or tower, and while inside the castle or tower, they would keep attacking it. It was very hard to figure out a way to implement this that wasn't horrifically annoying, so I decided on balance I should go with some of my safer and cleaner ideas. If you can believe that my weird-ass design so far is the safest and cleanest iteration of the Lombards that I came to. And with that, we come to the end. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch. Before we sign off today, I'd like to do something I neglected last time and give you what I call the Likely-ometer score. This represents how good of a fit I think the Lombards are for Age of Empires as of now, discounting my build entirely. Just how likely is it that a civilization called the Lombards could make it into Age of Empires and be a good fit there? And for the Lombards, we have on the Likely-ometer a 9 out of 10. Yes, I think the Lombards are a perfect fit for Age of Empires. They mesh well with a bunch of the other existing civilizations. They already feature in tons of campaigns. They're distinct enough from the Goths and Italians that currently represent them that I think there's a real niche for them in the game as we know it. With all that being said, I'd love to hear what you think about the Lombards in general and my build in particular. How do you like what I did with them? What would you do differently? Were there any elements that you think are horrifically off base or any that you think are strokes of genius? And lastly, what civilization would you like to see me build in the future? As always, my name is Robbie Howell. This has been my Theorycrafted build for the Lombards and Age of Empires 2, and ciao for now.